Hi, and welcome to the Protect Our Vote Defending Democracy During COVID-19 Town Hall. My name is Anna Kellar. I'm the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Maine. We're a nonpartisan organization that's dedicated to serving voters and defending our democracy. This town hall is part of a broader town hall series that's sponsored by the Declaration for American Democracy, a national coalition of over 160 member organizations dedicated to putting the power of our democracy back in the hands of the people. So tonight we'll be discussing the threat that COVID-19 poses to our elections, and more importantly, what we can do to protect our vote. If you have a question throughout this evening, please put it in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Our speakers will be answering questions at a couple of points during the evening. And for those of you who are watching on the Facebook live stream, please type your questions into the comments there, and we'll be taking questions from both Facebook and through Zoom. So why are we doing this? As you know, the threat of COVID-19 is putting our elections at risk, and the most important thing that we're asking for is for Congress to allocate at least $4 billion in the next COVID stimulus package to protect our elections this year. That's funding that could be used for reforms like no excuse postage paid, vote by mail, at least 2 weeks of early voting, online voter registration, same-day voter registration, safe and sanitary polling places that protect voters and workers, accessibility options for voters with disabilities, and other critical reforms. Some of these are things we already have in Maine, and some of them are things that we need, but for states all around the country and for voters all across the country, these reforms are really essential. So when we finish here, we're going to be asking you to call your senators and encourage them to vote for this stimulus package that includes $4 billion for elections. So we've got a great group of experts that are here tonight, and they're going to be able to shed some light on the situation and answer your questions. And our first expert is U.S. Senator Angus King. As many of you probably know, in January 2013, Angus King was sworn in as Maine's first independent United States Senator, filling the same seat that was once held by storied Maine leaders Edmund Muskie, George Mitchell, and Olympia Snowe. Senator King serves on the Armed Services Committee, the Select Committee on Intelligence, the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, and the Committee on Rules and Administration. He's also been a supporter of democracy reform, voting rights, and transparency legislation. And he was the governor of Maine from 1994 to 2002. After his remarks, we'll be taking questions for the senator, so please make sure to submit them in the Q&A box or in the Facebook comments. Senator King, thank you so much for joining us.
Anna, great to join you. It's so good to have you put this together to talk about, I think, one of the most important issues that we're going to be facing in the next round of COVID funding. And it's certainly, I mean, I think everybody on this call is on the call because they know how important it is. I think there are a couple of things I'd like to just say as a preliminary matter. You mentioned safety, and I saw an estimate that an average clerk at the polling place will interact with 700 people on election day. The average voter will interact with maybe 20. So we're really talking about safety of the frontline workers, of the people who are administering our elections, who, I don't know about your town, but in Brunswick, it's a lot of the same people, and they're public servants, they're nonpartisan, and they do it every year. So we really need to think about their safety. And of course, we don't know what the situation will be next November. Hopefully we'll be a lot better as far as coming out of this pandemic than we are now, but I think we have to prepare. My motto has always been hope for the best and prepare for the worst. And that's what we're really talking about tonight. In terms of aid from the Congress, in the bill that was passed about 2 weeks ago, we're calling it COVID-3, there was $400 million for assistance to states and localities, and that's really a down payment. I mean, that was a significant amount, but nowhere near what would be necessary to really make a significant change in the voting structure of our country. The second major thing to realize is that by and large, elections are defined and controlled and regulated by states and localities. We don't have a national voting system, and it can vary tremendously from state to state and sometimes from localities to locality. Now, the provision of the Constitution, if I can call it up here, that's really in question is Article 1, Section 4. And a lot of people and some of my colleagues keep saying that this is exclusively in the purview of the states, but actually the Constitution says the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, semicolon. Okay, so far. But the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations, except as to places of choosing senators. Now, why the Congress can't regulate that, I don't know. But the point being that there is an opportunity for Congress, for the federal government to have a role, not to take over elections, but to have a role in how this is construed. Now, every state is different. And I think I've got a map that I sent in today to the declaration folks. If you could put that up on the screen, I think that will be helpful in giving people a flavor of what we're talking about here. Have we got the map? I don't have it on my screen. There it is. Okay, good. So what we've got here is this is talking about voting by mail. And as you can see, the sort of western side, the left side of the country, from California to well, all the way over toward Illinois, there are variations of voting for mail. And you can see there are 4 states, Colorado, Utah, Oregon, and Washington, who essentially are 100% voting by mail. And this goes back to the early 90s. And interestingly, it was led in the 90s by the Republican Secretary of State in the state of Washington. So this gives you a flavor. Now, and then you see Maine up in the corner. We're a state where, if you look at the legend at the bottom, we can request to vote by mail in each election. Now I don't. Okay, I think we can. I think our viewers can see it. It's up there, and we all know where Maine is. But we're one of the states where people can request that they be able to vote by mail. In other states, they automatically are able to. So as you can see, there's a great change across the country. Now, the states in white: Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, Indiana, West Virginia, and South Carolina, they have no provision for voting by mail. And that's, that's a sign, and some of the New England states, as you see. So this is something that if we're going to facilitate this, it's going to be a very significant effort in a lot of states, and it's really going to have to happen in the states. I think it's unrealistic. I'm just giving you a political prediction now, but I think it's unrealistic to expect the Congress to mandate any particular kind of election system, even though the Constitution says, as I read it, the kind of strong tradition and history is that this is a straightforward state and local responsibility. So I think at the outset, you talked about $4 billion. And I don't know, I mean, that's a good number. And I think that's a number that I've seen in other places that would be necessary. I have no idea where the negotiations will be in the next round of talks for COVID-4, but providing the funds to the states in order to be able to modify their systems in time for next November is going to be important. And then the states have to take the initiative. And that's where groups like yours that have grassroots support all over the country are going to have to work with their local legislators, with their governors, with their secretaries of state, and with their local clerks to be sure that the system that emerges is safe, not subject to fraud, not subject to abuse or misuse, available, widely available, because what we really don't want is a repeat of what we saw in Wisconsin, where people are literally having to choose between taking a disease risk or exercising their right to vote. You should not have to make that kind of decision. So that's really the goal of the work that I think all of us are going to be engaged in the next 6 months. But it's a major task, and somehow we have to be sure that this is perceived, because I believe it is, as a nonpartisan task. This isn't designed, all the studies indicate that voting by mail doesn't favor one party or the other. That doesn't appear to be the case. And there are many Republicans, as I mentioned, this was really led by a Republican Secretary of State in the state of Washington, and the Republican Secretary of State there now is a big supporter of voting by mail. So, and I'm not saying that voting by mail is the only solution. Maine has a system, as many of you know, where you can go in, I call it no excuse absentee. You can go in, there's early voting in the period before the election. You can go in, you don't have to swear that you're not going to, you can't be around on election day or whatever the reason is. So that's another aspect of this. There are many permutations and combinations, but the conclusion, my belief is that we really have to start thinking very seriously right now about changes that will be necessary, assuming the worst, that we're going to not make our citizens make decisions between their health and safety, and particularly the health and safety of those election workers, those clerks, and their right to exercise their vote, which is the essence of our democracy. So that's sort of some background on this, and I look forward to working with all of you. And frankly, it's going to take grassroots support to be sure that a provision with substantial funding is in the next COVID package, and that it's not perceived as coming from one party or the other. I just think it's an important principle. Elections are at the heart of democracy, and we want elections to be fair and open, and we want full participation. And we have to be sure, given this terrible situation that we're in, that that's the reality in America in November of 2020. So Anna, that's the background.
Oh, thank you so much. We've got a bunch of questions in for you, but speaking of bipartisanship and nonpartisanship, I was hoping you could say a little bit more about what hopes you have for bipartisan cooperation around this stimulus fund, particularly given some of the rhetoric from President Trump about vote by mail and some of the ways that this has become more partisan.
Well, I think that's when people have to speak up, particularly people who are Republicans, who are historically have been Republicans, and said, look, this isn't, and all the studies indicate that it doesn't favor one party or the other. I think we just have to get that message out. But I'm not going to kid you. Getting the next package through the US Senate is going to take 60 votes. And it's going to take, that means it has to be bipartisan. Now, the history of these packages is particularly the last two, the big one that was passed about 3 weeks ago, the CARES Act, and then the one that was hopefully passed today. If somebody knows whether the House has passed it, I haven't seen the news yet, but it was supposed to be passed this afternoon in the House. Those did not start out as bipartisan. Leader McConnell put packages on the floor and basically said, here it is, take it or leave it. And the Democrats said, we're not going to support that. And then there were negotiations that made substantial changes. For example, in the package that we passed 2 days ago, there was $25 billion for testing. Wasn't in the original package that was put on the floor by Leader McConnell the week before. Same thing, $75 billion for hospitals and healthcare workers. That wasn't in the original bill. So there was a great deal of negotiation with Leader McConnell and Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy, and particularly Steven Mnuchin, the Secretary of the Treasury. And they came to a consensus, and the bill passed the Senate 2 days ago unanimously. Which is pretty amazing. The big one passed unanimously. Anytime you get Ted Cruz and Bernie Sanders voting for the same piece of legislation, you've achieved something. And I think that should be reassuring that we have been able to come together to do that. But the same, I suspect there will be a similar dynamic coming up on the next package. So far, the Senate has led these packages, but I understand Speaker Pelosi is talking about putting together her own package for COVID-4 and then sending it over to the Senate. So we'll have to see how that plays out. So I think that, but my main message is, get the message to your legislators, to your senators and members of Congress, because they're the ones that are going to be making this decision in the next, I'd say, 3 weeks.
Yeah, it's definitely urgent, and thank you. We're gonna put up a number that people can use to call their senators and members of Congress in just a moment. We've got a couple questions in about the dangers that the post office is in financially right now, given that voting by mail seems to be such a big part of the solution for us. What is being done to make sure that the post office will be there for us?
Well, the problem with the post office has been festering for 4 or 5 years, basically as long as I've been in the Senate. And the problem is that I think, I don't know when it was, 2010, 11, 12, a provision was passed that the post office had to fully fund its retiree health benefits in a very short period of time, much shorter than any private company or any state or federal office, and it's put an artificial burden on them that they can't meet. They can't break even given this huge, I can't remember, it's multi-billion-dollar obligation every year, and that's what's really burdening the post office. So we've tried. There've been bills and bills and bills and compromises. It's never quite gotten there. But of all things that shouldn't be a political issue, the post office is one of them. The post office is a basic piece of our national infrastructure, and I hope that we'll be able to resolve that. I doubt if it will be able to be resolved in the COVID bill. It's possible, but again, for some reason, this is one of those things that's become somewhat partisan. It shouldn't be. But that's the status of that.
Thanks. We have a question. Given your position on the Intelligence Committee and what's been learned about the 2016 election, what should be done to prevent election interference by other countries this year and other needs that we have around election security?
By the way, before I answer that, I don't think there's any doubt that the U.S. Postal Service will be up and running and able to do what's necessary this November. I mean, I don't want to give the impression that it's on the brink of collapse. That's not the case. The Postal Service will be there, and we're going to work these problems out. As far as foreign involvement in the election, first I have to tout a little bit that earlier this week, 2 days ago, our committee, the Intelligence Committee, issued the results of a 3-year study of the accuracy of the original intelligence assessment delivered in January of 2017, that the Russians interfered in our elections in a serious way, that it was directed by President Putin, that it was designed to denigrate Secretary Clinton, and that toward the end of the campaign, they developed a preference for candidate Trump. The news is that our committee, which is a bipartisan committee that's actually a majority Republican, unanimously endorsed that report. It was a unanimous report of the committee, and as far as I'm concerned, that closes that case. It's clear that what the Russians did, they did it systematically, and they're at it again. So what do? We have to be as alert as we possibly can to protecting our networks, and we should never have an election where there are voting machines that are online, that are on the internet. Ironically, the strongest recommendation is use paper. Always have a paper ballot backup, not a paper backup that can be audited. So that's one of the strongest recommendations. The problem is that one of the Russians' most effective tools, and it's now spread to other countries and other people trying to undermine our democracy, is disinformation. and the ease with which disinformation can be spread in this day and age, and the sophistication. You can now use the technology to create a reality that's not a reality, that you can have people saying things that they didn't ever say. And that can be then spread on the internet, and it's very hard to ever get it back. The work I've done, and I served as a co-chair of a commission on cyber protection that just issued their report about a month ago. The best defense for that is an informed citizenry. We have the First Amendment. We can't close down people's access to information. We have an open society, but what we have to do is be a little more discerning about what we read and believe and pass on, and be more careful about it. I've talked to people in Eastern Europe that have been putting up with this for years, and their response was, the best defense is for the people to know it's happening and to say, oh, it's just the Russians again. And that's really, I think, the attitude that we have to have, and we have to understand when people are trying to feed us misinformation, and try to make sure that we're getting good, solid information. But it's going to be, they're going to come at us. There's no question between now and November. And I think we're just going to have to be as prepared as we possibly can. I think the networks are better. The election systems are better. The states have strengthened their networks. But the disinformation part is the hardest to deal with. The other final piece, Mary says, I say finally, it gets people's hopes up, but I'll say it once here. Our country needs to declare to the world that if you attack us in this way, you're going to pay a price. There will be a response, not necessarily cyber, I'm not defining what the response will be, but one of the problems has been that we have been vulnerable to these kinds of attacks with no fear of reprisal from the United States. We're a cheap date. And that won't go. And the commission that I worked on, one of our major recommendations was a clear declaratory policy that there will be a response to cyber attacks on our country, such as attacks on elections. So hopefully we can make that point, and people will think twice before trying to interfere. I think interfere is a stronger word, interfere in our elections.
Thank you. That's great to have your perspective from inside the Intelligence Committee on that issue. Maine's moved its primary up from June to July 14th. A lot of states have been moving their primary elections. We have a question with anticipated new waves of COVID-19 in the fall. Could the national election be postponed? Who would have that power, and what would happen if that was the case?
National election can't be postponed. It's the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November of every even-numbered year, equally divisible by 4. There'll be a quiz on that. It can't be postponed. Congress can't change it. The president can't change it. And that's why it goes back to the very beginning. We have to do the work that we have to do to be sure that the election can be conducted safely and responsibly. But there is no provision in the Constitution or anywhere else that would allow the postponement of a national election. Primaries are a different thing. Primaries are governed by state law, and they're governed by the rules of the parties. But a national election is everything that I understand. And if there's somebody on this call that knows more than I do about this, which is entirely likely, but I don't believe that's something that is an option.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think you're right about that, and appreciate getting that message out. One question that's come up a couple of times is that folks are interested in what's going on with Washington, D.C. in the midst of this, given that Washington is not, D.C. is not a state, and the stimulus funding for D.C. is less than some smaller states because of that. Do you have anything you would want to say about making sure that residents of the capital get equal treatment under
Well,
the.
they didn't get equal treatment in the bill that passed 3 weeks ago, and I think it's something that's a concern, and they have been hit hard by the pandemic. I'm in Maine now, working from home, just as many of you are, and will continue to do so at least through next week. Speaker Leader McConnell has said that we're obligated to come back next Monday, the 4th, and we'll see whether that plan holds given the situation. But Washington D.C. has now seeing a rise in coronavirus cases, and the city should get a fair treatment in the next round. That's certainly something I think should be the case. I have a daughter that lives in Washington. She works with homeless people, and she's doing great work out on the front lines. And so I think it's not for that reason, but it just out of sheer fairness, we've got the capital city, and they should be treated adequately.
Thank you. One thing that we've run into with the first round of the election funding from the first stimulus package is that there is a match that is required for states, and a lot of states, including Maine, would have trouble appropriating matching funds in order to secure that. Would you support getting rid of those matching requirements in either retroactively or in future?
Yes. Yeah. In fact, I signed on to a letter doing just that today. The match, it's a 75-25 match, and that's typical in disasters, but there are cases where it's been waived and it can be reduced. It could be 90-10 or 100%. The states were appropriated a significant amount of money in COVID-3 to use for expenses incurred because of the virus. Unfortunately, it doesn't allow to replace lost revenues, which is where the states are really getting crushed. Just think of the gas tax. I mean, nobody's driving. So the estimates I've heard is that the gas tax, which funds the highways, has probably fallen 40% in the last month. And same with sales tax, other taxes that support the services that are needed during this problem. So the next round, and the president tweeted the other day that he's going to support a major appropriation for the states in COVID-4. And he made that commitment to Governor Cuomo a day before yesterday. The head of the National Governors Association has been very strong on this, Larry Hogan, Republican governor of Maryland. So hopefully we're going to be able to get a lower match rate and additional funding that will help the states with the enormous hit that they're taking with the loss of revenues caused by the pandemic.
Yes. So I think it's maybe our last question, but we've got a number of questions around people asking basically what can they do. We have one person say, what can I do as an elderly citizen of Maine to help make absentee voting a reality here? People are asking what they can do to reduce the political temperature around these issues.
Well, I think the first thing is that we have a pretty good system in Maine of absentee voting. I call it early voting, where you can go in anytime up to the weekend before the election. And I can't recall, is it maybe 3 weeks? Somebody knows, I'm sure. 3 weeks or so before the election, and you can vote. And you can vote at the town clerk's office, or they'll give you an envelope you can take home and vote and then mail it in. So Maine's in pretty decent shape with that in that regard. What I would suggest to that person is that they call their town clerk and ask the town clerk what they think we need to make this system better, and then talk to the legislature, the local legislators and state senators. That's where these policies are made, and also, of course, the town council and the selectmen. That's where most of these decisions are going to be made. As far as lowering the partisan temperature, I'd say be in touch with all of your legislators of both parties and say, look, this isn't a partisan issue. This is about democracy. I think believe it or not, politicians really are responsive to their constituents and who they hear from. And so often it's the people who are the most angry that take the trouble to call in or send emails. But it really makes a difference. I can tell you, it certainly does in my office. I know, how many people are calling, what they're calling about, I see a great deal of the mail, the email. So it does make a difference. And I think if people speak up, and particularly if you're speaking up for democracy, let your voice be heard now, so that we're sure that your voice will be heard in November.
Thank you so much, Senator. We really appreciate you joining us and answering so many questions and all of the work you're doing on behalf of us in Maine and around the country this year. We are going to take a second here to welcome people who have been joining us throughout the town hall. Before we move to talking more about some of our in-state issues and what is happening on the ground here with our panel. If I can pull up the slide that has a little bit of information for those of you who want to take Senator King's call to action and call your senators. We have a number here that can connect you. Yes, so there's a direct line that'll give you a little bit of information, get you prepped and ready to have your conversation if you call through this line, and we'll put it in the chat as well. And we're also encouraging everyone to request their absentee ballot. So thank you so much, Senator. I really appreciate you being with us tonight.
I'm going to stay with you and listen to the other questions, and who knows, it's in all likelihood I'll learn something.
Great. So we're going to move to what's going on the ground in Maine in regards to our elections, and to give us a briefing. I want to welcome Alison Beyea, who's the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union. We've been working with the League of Women Voters and a great coalition of more than a dozen organizations that are supporting the COVID election response here in Maine. And Alison and the ACLU have been part of that. So Alison, would you take it away?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Anna. And thank you to everyone on behalf of the ACLU of Maine and our almost 10,000 members all around the state. I'm sure many of them are on tonight. Just want to thank everybody for coming out in these really busy times to get really energized and excited about protecting the right to vote here in Maine. And of course, Senator King, always wonderful to have your leadership on these core issues down in DC. And we're really grateful for your voice always. And I think it's also probably good to start, as the Senator was saying, is to acknowledge that we are very lucky here in Maine. We have a governor and a secretary of state who are committed to the right to vote, committed to making sure that we have access to the ballot. We've seen what's happened in other states over the last few months. It's sort of really disheartening to see what can happen when leaders don't care about that. So, we can be proud. We have some of the better voting laws here in Maine. Many people on this call have worked for those for decades. So there's a lot to be proud of. But I think we can all agree that even with some of the best voting laws, they're probably not a match for COVID-19. And so we really are going to have to think about what we need to do in Maine and what we need to change to make sure that everyone can vote. So let's think about together, what is the work that we can do? What do we need to do? Starting off, I think you already mentioned, Anna, that we know a few things have been changed already. The governor has moved the primary to July 14th, and she's also extended the time in which you can vote absentee. What the senator was speaking of, you'll now be able to vote absentee up until Election Day. Great changes, going to expand the time we can get ready for an election, and expands the time to vote. So those are good first steps, but they are absolutely only first steps. And we really need to prepare, as the senator said, we need to hope for the best and plan for the worst. So what do we need to do? What do we all need to be thinking about and advocating for? We like to think about it in a couple of different buckets. Let's start with just something simple: voter registration. Voter registration right now, you have to do in person. With documentation. We need to make that much easier. We need to allow it to be electronic so that people can easily register to vote. We also want to think about absentee ballot. While it is a great process and it is, you can request it, it does have some complexities. It does take some work. And so we think it's really important and are advocating that all registered voters should have an absentee ballot sent to them so that people can really vote. We want to take care of those clerks. We want to make sure that there are as many people voting by mail as possible. And to that point, we want to make sure that people can actually mail it in. So we're facing some of the greatest economic crises that we've seen in this country. We need to make sure that stamps are provided. There needs to be a stamp so people can get that ballot and they can send it back in. And so we want to make it easy to do it by mail. But and we definitely care about this. We want to make sure as many people are voting by mail, but we can never forget that the ability to vote in person is one of the most critical abilities that we have. It's so core to this country. And then for many communities, and you'll hear about this more tonight, there are many communities for whom mail-in is just not an option. It's people with changing addresses, or people who just want to register to vote that day, or people in the disabled community who need assistance. So we want to make sure that for those core groups who need to be able to go on election day, they can go. The other issue we want to be paying attention to here in Maine is for those who are going to vote by mail, that they can absolutely, if there's any deficiency in their ballot, any problems with their signature, that they have the right to cure that. Right now, that doesn't exist, and we need to make sure that those laws are changed so people can go in and make sure that their vote is counted. So with all this list of things that we want to do, the last thing I would like to sort of suggest we all need to be paying attention to is it's all going to cost money. And as the senator was mentioning, and Anna, as you were talking about, right now there's a state match that's required. We need to do what we can to make sure that match is taken away. But if it's not, we need to make sure that Maine has the resources to actually give the Secretary of State and these very dedicated towns and cities the resources they need to make sure that every vote can be cast and every vote can be counted. And, I'm so grateful for everybody on this call and listening in or watching on Facebook, because I know you all are the people that are going to be working with us side by side to make sure that in the primary and in the general election, that we can all get out and vote, whether it's by mail or in person, and that this election is one we can be proud of. So thank you for all your support, Anna.
Thank you, Alison. Next, we're going to bring up a number of folks who are going to be able to talk to us about some of the different challenges the different groups of voters and our election officials are facing in this moment. And first, I want to turn it over to Kathy Montejo, Lewiston City Clerk, who is here to speak to us on behalf of town and city clerks. Thanks, Kathy.
Great, thanks so much for having us. There's municipal clerks, we've been working on these issues, and we really are looking at it at two events, because we have the July 14th election and then November. And to be perfectly honest, we're putting all of our brain power into July 14th, and November, we really even haven't had a chance to think about that through yet. But we do have some concerns regarding July 14th that we have identified and outlined, and we have shared with the Secretary of State's office and the governor's office, and they do understand our concerns. The number one concern is, frankly, our inability to adequately staff the polling places. As you know, the municipal clerks really do the work in advance of Election Day and all the preparation, but really the stars on Election Day are the citizens that we hire to work at the polls. Many citizens throughout the state who work at the polls tend to be retired folks because their schedule allows for it. As such, they fall into that at-risk category. And many are not interested in working at the polls for their own personal safety issues. And I'll give you an example. I heard from a clerk in Saginaw County last week. Saginaw County has 10 towns. They have, I think, 17 cases of known COVID-19 and no community spread. This municipal clerk has a municipal election in June and, of course, the state election in July. She called every single one of her election workers. None of them are willing to work at the polls. Every single one of them said to her, no, I'm not able to work. So she and I brainstormed some different ideas to recruit folks, but I think that just illustrates that it is a very real concern that all municipal clerks have statewide about the ability to adequately staff the polls on Election Day. So as such, we are looking at some measures. We again have reached out to the Secretary of State's office and the governor's office. It is determined community by community what is best for the polling place in their location. Some communities, such as Lewiston, are considering consolidating our polling places because of the inability to adequately staff. So in Lewiston, we have normally 7 polling places and hire about 150 workers. We're looking at consolidating down to 1 location with fewer workers. Other communities vote in a very small voting place space, and that works for them normally. But for this election, there simply isn't going to be enough room to spread out and do the adequate social distancing. So some communities are looking for permission to change polling places to a larger location, such as their fire station or school gym. And then others, their buildings may not be available. In Bangor, their civic center is going to be turned into a potential medical facility as needed. And in Lewiston, one of our polling places was just opened yesterday as a homeless shelter, as a wellness shelter. So that building is unavailable for me for the July 14th election potentially. So we're looking at needing to make some changes regarding some polling places to make it work for different communities because of our real concerns for inability to staff polling places. The Secretary of State's office has been wonderful. They are looking at providing PPE supplies for the workers. They recently just sent out an inventory survey to municipalities asking approximately how many supplies they need. We are also brainstorming additional safety precautions to implement at the polls, such as wiping down every pen after a voter uses it. Do we wipe down the pens? Do we simply buy a lot of cheap pens and tell them keep the pen? Do we tell people bring your own pen? The need to wipe down voting booths, the need to potentially have temporary plexiglass shields constructed by our public works crews and installed, similar to how you see at the grocery stores. So we're really brainstorming a lot of these different options that we can implement at the polls to create some safety for folks. We do understand the need for a balance as far as should it be an all absentee ballot election versus the need to have polls open, and we do understand that. As previous speakers have said, we certainly don't want to have anyone disenfranchised if they cannot obtain an absentee ballot for whatever reason. So we do understand the need to have one location open per community for folks to come in and take care of those in-person election related tasks. We are working though on a huge marketing outreach campaign, encouraging folks to request their absentee ballots and to request them early. We don't want to get slammed, just prior to election day. So we want people to start thinking about it now. People can start requesting their absentee ballots now. So you're going to see a lot of communities rolling out a marketing effort, encouraging people to request absentee ballots. We're also, with that, encouraging people to register to vote early by mail, as well as do their party enrollment by mail if needed. We're very lucky because coming off the March 3rd election, we did have several people who registered to vote for the first time or updated their address, as well as enrolled in a party. So that is helpful for us that a lot of those recent changes were captured at the polls on March 3rd. So that's helping update our list. But we're planning a large rollout of a marketing campaign to encourage people to absentee vote, to request their ballot early, to register to vote by mail if they need to do that, change their address by mail if they need to do that, or enroll in a party if they need to do that. Coupled with that, we also want to do some citizen education about how absentee ballots are processed at the town level. I know there might be some suspicion about that because it is sort of an unknown. It's something that isn't seen by a lot of voters. So we want to do a marketing and education campaign about that, how it's processed, how the anonymity of their ballot is protected, and you will not know how their ballot is, who they voted for on their ballot. It is definitely confidential. There are citizens who come in and do that work. It's balanced by the different political parties. That processing is actually open for public view by anyone who's interested, the media, candidates, anyone who wants to come and watch that. So all of that marketing, we really want to get out and educate the citizens in the next several weeks prior to the time for absentee ballots. And I will just clarify, because I think that question did come up from a previous speaker, is that absentee ballots will be available 30 days prior to election day by state law. So mid-June is when they'll start to go out. And I think with that, that's probably most of the items we wanted to cover, Anna, so I'm happy to wait and answer questions later on. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kathy, and thank you for the work that you are doing and your staff and all of the clerks around the state. You're being asked to do a lot, and you always do a lot, and we all really appreciate it. And just before we move on, if folks, if anyone is interested in being a poll worker, should they get in touch with their city clerk? Is that the right thing to do?
Absolutely, thank you. Any member of any community in Maine who is interested in serving their community on election day, they would absolutely be welcome and encouraged to contact their municipal clerk at the town office. Many town offices might be closed, as far as the building might be closed, but certainly services are still being provided. So we would encourage them to reach out to their municipality and volunteer to serve as a poll worker. Yes, thank you for that plug. We appreciate it.
Great. And I want to turn it over next to Laurie Parm from the AARP of Maine, for Laurie to tell us some about what you're thinking and your members are thinking in this moment.
Thanks, Anna, and also thanks to Kathy. What a bunch of great information that she shared today that I think will be very helpful for people who are listening. So AARP Maine is as concerned as everyone here today about the upcoming primary, and we're also looking to November. We have 230,000 members across the state, and we know that already older Mainers vote. Not only do they vote in the general election, but they vote in primary elections in very high numbers. But we're hearing from our members, and they are very concerned. We are, it's disappointing that we are in this place because, as Kathy mentioned, it's a lot of our members who are at the polls. A lot of our volunteers are working at the polls. But times have changed. They're very concerned, and they are really wanting to vote from home. And so our primary message right now as we go into July is that we are urging people to vote safely and vote from home. We recognize the need for polling places, and we will be focused on ensuring and advocating for safe spaces for people who do need to access the polls in person, but really hope that people will start to plan ahead, that they'll request their absentee ballot, and they will vote from the safety of their armchair if they can. We are really going to, working alongside with many others, going to really start a public education push. We've had conversations both with the governor's office and the Secretary of State as well. I think we all want the same outcome, and the more of us that can work together to make sure that people have the information, that we make it as simple as possible for folks to receive an absentee ballot, to vote from the security of their own home. That's what we're really looking for. We've also heard from members who are concerned about the post office. It's great that the senator was able to answer that question earlier and kind of address it. Our members care deeply about making sure not only for their ballots, but for their prescriptions and for other reasons that the post office is there. So I really appreciate that information. But for us, that really will be the focus. I know we're getting short on time, so I'll leave it there, and we'll hopefully be able to get to some questions.
Thanks, Laurie. And finally, I want to bring on Robyn Merrill, the Executive Director of Maine Equal Justice, another member of our coalition working on election issues. Thanks, Robyn.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, everyone. Everyone who's spoken, it's good, it's great, and everyone who's joining tonight to talk and think about being proactive in terms of addressing this critically important issue. Maine Equal Justice, we're a civil legal aid organization and economic justice organization, really focusing on increasing economic security, opportunity, and equity here in Maine. And we are working to represent the interests of folks with low income across the state. And right now, due to the consequences of illness, of unemployment, there are so many folks who are at risk of experiencing hunger and eviction, default on a mortgage, and homelessness. So we're working hard to help people meet their basic needs and to exercise their basic rights during these challenging times. And really see, one of the most important ways we can respond in this public health emergency is by strengthening our democracy. We want to make sure that everyone's voice is heard, and and that everyone's vote is counted, even in the midst of this crisis. So we must look at ensuring that elections are administered fairly, and that we're protecting access to voting for every eligible Mainer. And really see that as a responsibility that we all have here to come together and make sure that everybody is able to have their vote counted. And so in light of the public health emergency, and it's great to hear and appreciate, I think, real importance that we want to place on strengthening the vote by mail process and really making it easier for people to vote by mail. And also recognizing what's been touched on already by others. It was great to hear Kathy recognize this too, just the need to also preserve the ability for folks to vote in person safely for folks who need to do that. Voting by mail isn't possible for some folks. For some people, that would be a real barrier. And we think about people who lack a mailing address. And we think about folks who may have a disability or face language barriers. We have to make sure that we're not disenfranchising any of these folks, and that we're getting and being proactive in terms of making sure that everybody is able to cast a vote and to do that safely. We're talking to folks every day and just also thinking about people who lack, and I'm going to try to wrap up because I know time is limited, but just like in terms of the economic upheaval that we're facing here, and recognizing that there's going to be a lot of dislocation and increase potentially in homelessness. We really want to make sure everybody is able to vote and able to vote in the weeks leading up to election day, and then on election day itself. So we're looking forward to really working with others, with all of you, to proactively ensure that every single Mainer is able to vote, and that people have a fair and safe way to do that.
Thanks so much, Robyn. Appreciate all of your work. And so now, if you've got questions for any of our speakers, we've had a number of questions come in. And a lot of folks are really interested in the voter registration process and whether it would be possible for Mainers to register to vote online, and what the process looks like if you can't go in and register in person right now. And I think really anyone who'd like to take a stab at the online question around online voter registration, be my guest.
I'm happy to take that if you like, Anna.
Thanks, Alison.
And have other people weigh in if I think we think that obviously it would take some changes, and there's some things that need to be done, but we're encouraging the Secretary of State to think about how we could fill out the form that's available on the Secretary of State's website and email that. Also email pictures of the supporting documentation. And then if there's any concerns about that documentation, that the ballot could be held in sort of a different category and there would be an opportunity to look into it. So it's not to minimize that this would be a big change, but it is something that we've done technologically in lots of other areas. And so we're really hopeful that that there's got to be a way to make this, reduce this barrier. When you think about all the people that want to vote in this election and how critical 2020 is going to be, we absolutely have to reduce those barriers given the crisis of COVID-19. So that's what we're asking for.
Thanks. We've had a number of questions and practical questions that people have, and I'm going to look first to you, Kathy, but if others want to add to this. One question was, if you request an absentee ballot, do you have to use that ballot, or could you later decide to vote in person?
Sure, people they have the option. If they, if they request an absentee ballot and then for whatever reason change their mind, as long as they don't send that ballot back in, they can show up at the polls and receive a ballot, and then they could just destroy their absentee ballot at home. So yes, they definitely can do that.
Great, thanks. What would the process look like right now if someone is sheltering at home and knows that they need to register to vote or change their party or any of those things, or is living in a new place. What would that process look like for them right now?
Sure, their best bet would be to reach out to their municipal clerk. Again, either maybe with a telephone call to their town office or an email to the town office. And the municipal clerk can mail them a voter registration card. And that is also how you would capture party enrollment. And in Lewiston, we've been mailing out several cards in the past several weeks. So it's very easy to do. So I would just say if folks are interested, they would just reach out to their own municipality.
Would they have to send in documentation with it as well?
They would. There's instructions on the card for that. So all the instruction and information is on the card. Also, the Secretary of State's office website has full information there as well.
Thanks, Kathy. A number of people have asked why could Maine send out absentee ballots? I know Alison touched on this. Could Maine proactively send out absentee ballots to all registered voters, and whether that would be a good idea for us in this election, like some of the states in the West do?
Right, that would really need to be answered by, I think, the Secretary of State's office. There are some pros and cons with that regarding logistics, law changes and whatnot. There is a difference between an all-mail ballot and an all-mail ballot election and an all-absentee ballot election. The absentee ballot election, of course, is incumbent upon the voter to take the initiative to request a ballot. No different than driving to a polling place, walking in, stating your name and address and saying, I'd like a ballot. They're requesting it one form or another. So really, that question really needs to be answered by the Secretary of State's office, I think. I know there have been some suggestions about mailing out an application to request an absentee ballot and then allowing voters to fill that out and mail that in. So the voters still would need to take some initiative, but that might be sort of a happy medium potentially.
Thanks. There's been a couple of questions about what the checks and balances are in place for absentee voting and vote by mail, and whether there are any risks of fraud involved and what kinds of procedures are in place there.
Sure. So when an absentee ballot is requested, people need to submit a written application with their signature, or they can do it through the phone or through the computer, through the online service. But there are some checks that go on behind the scenes to verify that they are a registered voter. Then the ballot will be mailed out to them. When they receive the ballot, vote it and fill it out and mail it in, they need to sign the back of their envelope. So we have that signature to match up on their voter registration card to verify that it is the voter. And then when they're received at the municipality, then they are processed either before election day, a couple days prior to, or on election day. And again, that there's a system that the Secretary of State's office has laid out for all municipalities to follow regarding processing of that. Processing is done also by, again, the citizens. So you're hiring some folks from both political parties for that balance and that checks and balance. And it is a public observation process. So again, citizens, media, candidates, anyone could come in and watch that process as well.
Great, thank you so much. We keep getting questions, and unfortunately we're going to have to wrap it up, but I know that any of our panelists would be happy if you reached out to them and had more questions about any of the things that they've talked about. We want to remind you a couple of things that have come up that you can do to take action. You first and foremost can request your absentee ballot. Check with your friends and family, make posts on Facebook, get the word out there that anyone who can vote absentee in this election. By doing so, you're helping to make it safer for those who can't and for the poll workers. You can call your US senators and representatives and urge them to vote for additional funding for our elections this year, and that, like Senator King said, that's going to be decided in the next few weeks. So we definitely urge you to call. And if you are feeling fired up and you want to get more involved with this effort, the folks at Declaration for American Democracy have a quick way for you to submit letters to the editor. I will say on behalf of the League of Women Voters that we would love you to come be part of our team working on all of this. I know that all of the great organizations here are involved too. And you know, if you're sitting at home and feeling stressed out about this election, we can find something for you to do. Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate our panel and all of you for tuning in, and great questions.